Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing the issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? Let me introduce you to my regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faiths. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who is the Associate Pastoral Director for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to our conversation. Let's get into segment one. Segment one is talking about the International Religious Freedom Report that has just come out in 2022. In June of this year, the U.S. State Department has released the International Religious Freedom Report from 21. It's describing the status of religious freedom in every country around the world. The report covers government policies, those who are violating religious beliefs. It juxtaposes a lot of that information in comparison to what we see here, even in the United States. The State Department tries to put this report out on a regular basis. It's in accordance with the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. This act really defines what particular concerns that we may have with countries. But one of the things that's very interesting is that for a number of years, there's been a lot of information looking to find out where certain countries, for example, Russia may fall on this list. And for a long period of time, it did not. However, at this point, we're starting to see a list of countries, including China, Eritrea, and this year, for the first time, it includes Russia. You know, I got to ask you a question and trying to figure out where exactly this is going. Bettina, can you tell us whether this is more political or is this more business, or what exactly does this report mean and how exactly does it impact our lives?
Sure. Well, Olin, the fact that it includes Russia for the first time this year, piece that together with the fact also that it doesn't include Nigeria and India, and put those pieces of the puzzle together, and you'll find that the State Department can never be a wholly neutral, disinterested voice on the issue of international religious freedom. Because let's face it, the goal of promoting religious freedom internationally sometimes conflicts with the State Department's number one goal, which is to advance America's foreign policy interests globally. So, sometimes these two goals are fundamentally incompatible. So what we've seen here with this list is something that happens every year, which is that countries are named as countries of particular concern. And as you rightly pointed out, Olin, that includes China, that includes Eritrea, it includes Myanmar, Pakistan, all the usual suspect, but it leaves off some of the obvious countries in this paradigm. So, when you say, is it political, is it wholly neutral, I would err on the end of the spectrum toward political.
Well, I got to ask you this question. If all of this really is trying to compare what goes on a worldwide basis, about 80% of the world, as we know it, do not get a chance to serve their God the way they see fit. So with that in position, how do you even draw an analysis on this? I mean, Todd, you find yourself traveling around the world dealing with these issues. How do you juxtapose all of that?
Well, I think that the challenge is with these reports is who makes the list, right? And there are places in the world where there are political problems, places are religious problems, and other places where there's similar problems, and you don't always see a similar level of treatment in the report. And I think that's where a lot of the concern comes from.
So when I look at this report, the fact that you can put one country against another, it's very difficult, especially when you have all of these different religions that you're seeing. Tim Schultz, you look for protection of all faiths in the job that you're in. How do you take a look at this report as it relates to all the different denominations, all the different religions that are out there to find out what's really being fair or what's probably being just jaunted up from a political standpoint?
So my perspective on this is that this is always going to be a kind of helpful but very incomplete approach to discussing these issues. I'd rather that we be doing this than nothing. But at the same time, I think we always ought to take these things with a grain of salt, because I think in some ways they tend to underreport the problems with religious persecution around the world.
Well, if the State Department has got its other objectives, can we even take this seriously from the standpoint that it's not going to be political? I mean, Lawrence, you live in an area that's probably one of the most diverse areas in this country. And the idea of trying to figure out how do you determine who's, quote unquote, engaging in right political activities as it relates to religious freedom in a place like New York, I mean, this has got to be confusion because there's a different thing going on in every corner there.
Well, this whole thing begs the question, what are you really trying to accomplish? I agree with Tim, it's better to have something than nothing. But it seems to me, if you're going to have the built-in conflict of interest that is always going to be the case if it's the State Department leading out, then why not relegate the responsibility to a different agency? Because let's face it, either we're going to have window dressing or we're going to have a critical discussion of real issues. Because where I sit, this idea that, you want to be careful not to hurt people's feelings for calling them out for bad behavior. At some point, I'm like, okay, folks, either we're going to speak truth to power or we're not. We got to figure out what it is we want to accomplish. And then if we're serious about wanting to address the glaring issues of the day, make sure it's put in the hands of somebody that can do that so that we're not just window dressing, because window dressing is only good at Christmas time.
But Bettina, doesn't this beg the question that sometimes you've got to be cautious because people who live in glass houses probably should not throw stones? So on one hand, you want to point out what's going on in everybody else's situation, but you have to really sit back and analyze your own set of circumstances. Is that part of the reason why we see a little bit of a pushing forward and pulling back when it relates to this?
You have just articulated much of the pushback that comes from many of the countries that find themselves on the countries of particular concern watch list. You have countries shooting out their press releases saying, well, in the US, such and such is the case, so how can you judge what's happening here? Earlier this year, I had the chance to interview a former ambassador at large for international religious freedom at the State Department, Sam Brownback. And I talked to him about the limitations of this approach. As Lawrence has just said, this really is about naming and shaming countries. And what are we really trying to achieve with that? And Ambassador Brownback had an interesting answer. He said that when he was at the State Department, he tried a carrot and stick approach. And yep, the stick was the CPC list. Countries didn't want to end up on that. But the carrot was his office was very intentional in working with countries that were sort of teetering on the edge of that designation and trying to partner with them and trying to work with them, form relationships, help them understand that religious freedom brings a whole host of benefits for their country, not least greater economic prosperity. I mean, that is a data verified benefit of religious freedom in a country. So that was Ambassador Brownback's approach. And I do think the State Department does try to do that behind the scenes. But what we see with these sort of public announcements of the, name and shame CPC list is a very negative way of approaching it. And I think Ambassador Brownback is right. I think it does have limited efficacy in the long run.
Well, what was the overall objective? I mean, now you point this out from a country's perspective. Is there any teeth that can actually be utilized in this? Or is this really just putting names out there and hoping for the best? I mean, Tim Schultz, what have you seen when you're looking around and you see this report? Does this really make any impact and cause any change?
I don't really know that it does on the margins, except perhaps on the margins. I think that it would be paired with something like Bettina was talking about, engagement by our State Department with those countries that are actually amenable to persuasion. The problem is always that the countries that are most abusive to religious freedom are also those countries that tend to not be all that amenable to what the United States has to say. So you got to kind of go with those edge cases, as she says, that are sort of teetering on crossing into bad territory and hope that you can influence them. But again, I think that these are marginal benefits, but probably still worth having those marginal benefits compared to zero.
So Todd, how do you deal with this? You've traveled all around the world, dealt with issues in some of these particular countries like Pakistan and seeing how it's been impacted. What can we actually do to be trying to make a difference, or are we just simply at the mercy of whatever happens in these countries?
Well, we're not at the complete mercy of what happens in these countries. There are partners you can find and other ways of working and trying to influence in individual situations. We've had luck, for instance, getting individuals released in jail for violating Pakistan's blasphemy law, etc. But it takes a lot of knowledge about the local situations. It takes a lot of patience and diplomacy, especially when you're, not a governmental organization, right? When you're a church, when you're a private organization, you just have a whole lot of limitations. You don't have the near amount of power, and you've got a lot of other interests because, you may still have members in that country that you need to make sure aren't going to be harmed by anything you do. So it can be incredibly difficult in some of these countries. And of course, in some places, it's just impossible, right? I mean, North Korea is not really a place you're going to be operating. Others, it's just a lot more difficult. And so it get really handled on a case-by-case basis.
I got to ask you this question, and Lawrence, this may impact you the most. I mean, you're in New York there where we start to see the United Nations. Is this maybe something that we could see the UN at some point deciding to get more aggressively involved, especially if you can tie it from an economic standpoint? If you can start to demonstrate how this benefits a country financially and really be able to do so, maybe we may see something going along those lines. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, hope springs eternal. And as Bettina pointed out, if you can help people appreciate that doing the right thing in the long run works out to everyone's benefit, especially financial benefit, then, we can hope. But something like this always introduces us to four words. A country lands on the list and they look at you and say, yeah, okay, so what? And to the extent that we can help incentivize doing better and treating their people better, then, like I said, hope springs eternal.
Well, Lawrence, I'm going to have to let you have the last word on that. But it's a topic I think we're going to see more and more conversation taking place over and over again. But we will have to really rely on that hope will spring eternal. Let's move on to our next topic. Wanted to talk about a really interesting case. The case is called the Young Israel of Tampa versus the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority. This was a case that came out in October of 2020, where you had an Orthodox Jewish synagogue that submitted an ad to the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority, a group they call HART. They were seeking to advertise their annual celebration of Hanukkah. But HART rejected the ad because it said that it was religious. And after an appeal, then HART said that it would run the ad only if it was censored or references and things of that nature. The fact of the matter is that the court ended up ruling in favor of the religious organization, which is something that I thought maybe ran contrary to what the Supreme Court had said in the past. But Todd, could you give us a little bit of color on what was going on in this case and how we even got to this point?
Sure. So the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority had developed a policy that said that primarily religious advertisements would not be accepted for their buses. This came out of a situation they'd had several years before, where an organization called CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, had wanted to run some advertisements. They had pushed back on that. They'd come to an agreement with CARE. CARE had run the advertisements. Then another organization came in and attempted to run sort of counter advertisements, being critical of Islam and making reference to honor killings and to other situations that they felt reflected poorly on Islam. And apparently the transit authority just didn't want to be in the middle of this and didn't want to have sort of a religious war going on the side of their buses and their advertising space. So they developed a policy that said that nothing that was primarily religious could be advertised. Now, a lot of our listeners, our viewers might think, well, that's clearly unconstitutional, right? Government can't, prohibit speech, even in an advertisement on a bus. However, there actually is a disagreement in the courts on this because the Supreme Court a number of years ago had said in an election case that they could prohibit an entire sort of category of speech. So in other words, you couldn't take some people who are running for office and not others, but if you wanted to turn down all political advertisements, all campaign advertisements, you could do that. And so that's what the Hillsborough Area Rapid Transit or Regional Transit Authority was trying to do. They said was, we're just not taking any religious advertisements. The challenge was And what the court found, at least the district court found, was that this was what they called viewpoint discrimination, because you could run Christmas advertisements if you're Macy's, but you couldn't run a Hanukkah advertisement if you're a Jewish synagogue. And the court found that to be what's known as viewpoint discrimination and said that was unconstitutional. But there is absolutely disagreement in the courts on this because other cases in other parts of the country have gone just the complete opposite direction.
You know, isn't this one of those things, though, that to put this out there and to actually have transit authority organizations having to make these type of decisions? I mean, it almost seemed like you were safer to be in a position where you just said, listen, let's just do none of this. You know, if you can ban tobacco, you can ban alcohol, you can ban profane language, nudity, and things of that nature. Is it that important that we allow religious organizations to be able to put advertisement in place? I mean, Lawrence, you're in New York City. You probably see more of this type of advertisement than any place else. What is your thoughts? I mean, it sounds to me like it may be safer just to keep it all off completely.
Well, I prefer the approach that we've taken here, at least in New York City, because here in New York City, what happens is, other than just giving the conventional holidays off for school, the school system here has now gone a different direction. They give the regular holidays off. They also have the big Muslim holidays that they recognize. And they do this for several other groups as well. And it tends to be more inclusive. Nobody feels like, you know, your holiday is more important than mine. But if you handle this the right way, you can create a category that says, especially when it comes to holidays, that people get to highlight the best of what they have, and let's avoid the negativity of one group tearing down another group, because I think that's really what you're trying to avoid. We've had Christmas forever. We've had Hanukkah forever. And some of the other holidays that are coming into notice as our populations become more diverse begin to factor in. And it's just an opportunity for everybody to put their best foot forward, or the best of what they offer on display. And it enriches everybody. You get to learn about holidays that you didn't know about. And I mean, we all are better off when we understand each other and appreciate each other more. So I prefer an approach that tries to nuance things a little more and come with an outcome where we can still benefit from the diversity without getting bogged down in all the negative back and forth.
But Bettina, where do you draw the line here? You know, once you start allowing one religious organization to go with something that they're comfortable with, now all of a sudden somebody wants to depict a sacrifice taking place, or they want to depict something else that part of our society may say we're not comfortable with. If you begin this for one group, how do you end up stopping this at all? You know, where does the train stop if you allow this to start moving this direction?
Well, I like the word that Lawrence just used, which was nuance. And this is a complex and nuanced area of law. And because of the way our constitutional system operates, where we do accept religious expression in the public space, we do have to engage with these difficult tasks. I mean, and I'd much prefer to have to engage with that difficult line drawing process than something like France, which has sort of a militant secularist approach of laicity, where it is actively seeking to expunge all religious expression or religious identity from the public space. So, you know, look at the options. We can engage in the hard yards of constitutional interpretation, or we can just simply say no religious messaging in the public square. I know which one I'd prefer.
Tim, which one would you prefer?
I think Bettina said that very well. I mean, I think the problem is that the moment you start having advertising on public transit for alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and then you extend that into kind of other things as well, you're essentially inviting religious messages to be advertised. And the reason is because religion is very important to people. And so people are, if tobacco is important to people, religion's much more important to people. And people are going to want to say in advertisements what they think. And that's going to invite counter statements about what they think. And so it really is a question of having, I think, advertising about any part of human experience on the side of your transit or none. And I think as long as we have advertising, it probably ought to involve religion, and that's going to occasionally involve some clash. And that's just better, I think, than nothing at all.
But this works well. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Todd.
Yeah, so the challenge is, what Lawrence mentioned was, everyone talking about the best of each other. That's almost certainly unconstitutional, right? You can't have a rule that says only positive viewpoints are respected. And so what these transit authorities have attempted to do, and like I said, there is a 1970s era Supreme Court decision that, gives some credence to this, is just simply to say, listen, there's certain categories that are too hot to handle. And I will say, of course, tobacco is covered by the Master Settlement Agreement and so forth, and you don't see tobacco ads on buses anymore. But, even alcohol is banned in a lot of these places, so they do ban other categories. The challenge really is Christmas, because they're not going to ban advertisements for Christmas commercial sales. Macy's, other places, the holidays, you can't really ban that and have much of an advertising market. But Christmas is inextricably a religious holiday, and so if Macy's can advertise Christmas to sell, underwear, then why can't, the archdiocese, advertise Christmas to promote what it actually is meant to celebrate?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is, you just brought the point up, Todd, that it's really allowing most of this to take place as it relates to the economic benefit of an organization. I don't think that anyone is thinking that Macy's is promoting Christmas from a religious standpoint, but I think when you start seeing Hanukkah, or you start seeing Kwanzaa, or you start seeing other religious organizations, it is closely tied in. So to one extent, I can see where it's going, but on the other extent, it seems to me that we want to find a happy medium. I understand the nuance, but in the same breath, the Supreme Court actually came in and thought the idea of maybe just keeping it all off made sense. So where do you think we may end up with this? Lawrence, what is your thoughts where we may end up?
Well, here's the thing. You talk about the financial benefit. Need I remind the audience that Hanukkah is 8 days of gift giving? So I suspect that Macy's has an interest there as well. And I just think that somehow, and I know with the polarized environment that we're in today, I might be pie in the sky, but I just hope that somehow we can get to a place where we can ferret out some of the nonsense and come up with something that just makes sense on its face and that works for everybody.
Well, I'd like to think that would be the case as well. But Bettina, if I look at this and I try to understand where a Supreme Court who's already got some jurisdiction in place or some precedent in place, where could we imagine the court end up taking this based on the court that we see in place now?
Right. Well, I don't think any court watchers are in any doubt where or the lean or the direction where the court will take this in terms of protecting religious speech and expression in the public square. I think I'm not a prophet. I like to imagine I am sometimes, but I'm not in this area. But what I do know is that, when you're looking at the facts of this case, where you have the HART Transit Authority engaged in actually trying to edit a Jewish Chanukah advertisement to make it appropriately non-religious. They actually suggested taking out certain elements to make it appropriately non-religious. That, to me, is that is not the direction where I hope this will go.
Tim Schultz, let me ask you this. They allowed them to make some modifications. If you were going to be looking or advising some of the individuals you work with in this area, what are the modifications you think you could tell them to move forward with that might allow this to be this nuanced approach that we're talking about so that they have valid arguments to continue to have this type of presentation from an ad standpoint?
Well, my advice would be, because I think the law is ultimately going to protect their right to say what they want, I would advise them to not make modifications. I think if you are doing a Hanukkah ad, trying to strip it of its religious content would be not in the best interest of Jewish organizations, and I would advise them not to accede to that requirement.
Well, let me tell you, as somebody who grew up in New York, I actually enjoyed the idea of seeing a lot of the different religious organizations out there, having an opportunity to learn some things. And I think if we could find a way to utilize this as a way from an informational and educational standpoint, I think we all may be better off when this is all said and done. Well, listen, I want to thank you guys for this particular segment, and I appreciate understanding a little bit more of where these cases may go. Let's go to our last segment. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The Supreme Court this term has apparently permanently instituted live streaming of its oral arguments. So if you want to hear the arguments as they're doing, no longer do you have to stand out in the cold for a long time. You can sit in the comfort of your home and continue listening to them like they started during the pandemic.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Got a fun fact for you, Orlin, but it has serious implications. And that is on April 14, 2023, that's the date that the UN estimates that India's population is finally going to surpass China and become the world's most populous country. We talked about India being left off the State Department's watch list for religious freedom violations. Well, you know, the fact that we're going to see India not just as the world's largest democracy, but the world's most populous country. The fact is, what happens in India matters when it comes to international religious freedom.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
The American Time Use Survey was released last week. It showed that compared to 8 years ago, Americans spend 9 fewer hours per week in person with friends. That time is then being replaced by time on smartphones, and it's a big reason why we have so much political polarization these days.
Wow. Lawrence Brown, tell me something I don't know.
Our last piece had the menorah as the centerpiece of discussion. And when it comes down to who has the largest menorah, it comes to the Battle of the Boroughs, because here in New York, Manhattan has one that is 36 feet, and they claim the largest menorah. Brooklyn's counter to that is, well, ours is 32 feet, which actually fits within the quote unquote kosher designation for what the menorah should be. So we have the biggest appropriate menorah.
Guys, I just want to thank you for that. And there's nothing more appropriate than having the right size menorah. So we appreciate that conversation. And it was great having you with us today. Thanks again for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.